Hey, welcome to Campfire. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? I love knowing who's still with me, following every eerie twist. Drop a comment, get cozy, and let's begin. Have you ever had one of those friends who knows exactly what they want from life? The sort who's got everything mapped out, every goal clearly defined, every step planned to the last detail? That was Sarah. Even at university, whilst the rest of us were stumbling about trying to figure out who we were, she had this unshakable sense of direction. So when she rang me up last September and suggested a camping trip to Iowa, I knew there was more to it than just wanting to spend time in nature. Sarah didn't do anything without a reason, especially not something as spontaneous as a weekend camping trip to the American Midwest. It's for my dissertation, she explained when I pressed her about it. I'm researching historical navigation methods, particularly how Native American tribes use natural landmarks for wayfinding. There's this place called Backbone State Park that has some fascinating geological features I want to document. Sarah was doing her PhD in anthropology at Cambridge, specializing in indigenous cultures and their relationship with landscape. Brilliant stuff, really. Though sometimes I wonder if she spent so much time studying other people's connections to place because she'd never quite found her own. I was working as a freelance photographer then, mostly corporate events and weddings, nothing particularly inspiring. The idea of a trip to photograph some interesting rock formations sounded like exactly the sort of break I needed. Plus, Sarah had always been my favorite person to travel with. Organized enough to handle all the logistics, adventurous enough to make things interesting. We flew into Des Moines on a Friday evening, hired a car, and drove north through countryside that looked like something from a painting. Rolling hills, endless fields of corn stubble, farmhouses with lights glowing warm in their windows. Sarah spent the drive telling me about the geological history of the region, how the retreating glaciers had carved out the valleys and ridges that gave Backbone State Park its name. The native tribes called it something that translates roughly to the place where paths converge, she said, consulting her research notes whilst I drove. They believed it was a kind of spiritual crossroads, a point where multiple worlds touched each other. Multiple worlds? Different dimensions of existence. The physical world, the spiritual world, the world of ancestors, the world of possible futures. They thought that if you knew how to read the signs properly, you could use this place to find your way between them. It sounded like the sort of thing that would fascinate Sarah. The intersection of practical navigation and spiritual belief, the way people create meaning from landscape. She'd written her master's thesis on similar themes, examining how different cultures use natural features to orient themselves not just physically but psychologically and spiritually. We arrived at the park just as it was getting dark, rain beginning to speckle the windscreen. The self-registration system was simple enough, though Sarah spent ages studying the map, comparing it to historical surveys she brought along. I want Site 15, she said finally. It's positioned at the convergence of 3 different trail systems, and according to my research, it's built on what used to be a traditional gathering place. The drive to Site 15 took us deeper into the park than I'd expected, winding along narrow roads that seemed to twist back on themselves. By the time we reached our destination, the rain was coming down steadily, and I was questioning the wisdom of camping in this weather. But Sarah was in her element. Even in the rain, she was taking photographs of the surrounding landscape, making notes about the positioning of various geological features. The campsite itself was lovely, a circular clearing surrounded by ancient oaks, with a fire ring positioned at the exact center. "Look at this," she said, shining her torch on the ground around the fire ring. "Do you see the pattern?" I looked where she was pointing and saw what appeared to be a series of small stones arranged in a rough circle around the fire pit. At first glance, they looked random, but as Sarah moved her torch beam, I could see there was definitely some sort of intentional arrangement. "It's a compass rose," she explained excitedly. 8 stones positioned at the cardinal and intercardinal directions. This isn't just a standard Park Service installation. Someone's created a proper navigational aid here. Have you ever been with someone when they discover something that perfectly aligns with their interests? Sarah was practically vibrating with excitement as she documented the stone arrangement, taking measurements and photographs from multiple angles. I set up our tents while she worked, content to let her enthusiasm carry us both. We got a fire going despite the rain, and Sarah spread out her research materials on the picnic table under a tarp. Maps, historical documents, photographs of similar stone arrangements from other parts of the Midwest. She'd been planning this trip for months. I realized, gathering evidence for some theory she was developing. "The thing is," she said as we sat around the fire, "most people think navigation is just about getting from point A to point B. But for many indigenous cultures, it was about so much more. It was about understanding your place in the cosmic order, about finding your proper path not just through physical space, but through life itself. And you think this place was used for that? I think this place still is used for that. Look at the wear patterns on these stones. They're not historical artifacts. Someone's been maintaining this arrangement, adding to it, using it for its original purpose." She was right. Now that she pointed it out, I could see that the stones weren't weathered in the way you'd expect from something that had been sitting here for decades. They looked deliberately placed, carefully maintained. "Using it how?" I asked. Sarah pulled out one of her research books and showed me a diagram of a traditional medicine wheel. In many Native American traditions, these kinds of stone arrangements were used for ceremony and guidance. You'd pose a question about your life's direction, then use various methods, meditation, fasting, sometimes plant medicines, to receive insight about which path to take. That sounds a bit unscientific. She laughed. That's the Western perspective talking. These practices developed over thousands of years, refined through countless generations. They might not use the same methods as modern psychology, but they're addressing the same fundamental human need, the need to understand where you belong and where you're going. As if to emphasize her point, a gust of wind sent the rain swirling around our campsite, and I noticed something odd. Despite the weather, our fire was burning steadily, the flames barely flickering despite the wind, and the rain, whilst I could hear it drumming on the trees around us, didn't seem to be falling directly on our camp circle. "Sarah," I said, "is it just me, or is the weather behaving strangely here?" She looked up from her notes, noticing for the first time what I'd observed. "That's actually quite interesting. The stone arrangement might be positioned to take advantage of natural wind patterns, creating a kind of microclimate." But even as she said it, I could tell she wasn't entirely convinced by her own explanation. There was something about this place that didn't quite follow normal rules, something that made the rational part of my mind uncomfortable while simultaneously drawing me in. That's when we heard the singing. It was very faint at first, barely audible over the rain and wind. A voice, or maybe multiple voices, carrying a tune that seemed to come from no particular direction. Not English. Something older, more rhythmic, rising and falling in patterns that felt familiar even though I'd never heard the language before. "Do you hear that?" I asked. Sarah nodded, her anthropologist instincts immediately engaged. "It sounds like traditional chanting. There must be other people here, maybe conducting some sort of ceremony." We listened for several minutes, trying to determine where the sound was coming from. But it seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once, as if the landscape itself was singing. Should we go investigate? I suggested. No, Sarah said firmly. If there's a ceremony happening, we shouldn't intrude. Many indigenous practices are meant to be private, especially if they're being conducted in a traditional sacred space. So we sat by our fire, listening to the distant chanting, both of us feeling like we'd stumbled into something much larger than a simple camping trip. The singing continued for what felt like hours, weaving in and out of rain sounds, sometimes clear and sometimes so faint we wondered if we were imagining it. When it finally stopped, the silence felt profound. Not just the absence of sound, but the presence of something else, an expectancy, as if the landscape was waiting for something to happen. I want to try something, Sarah said suddenly. The ritual I was reading about, it's quite simple, actually. You just need to pose a question to the compass rose, and then spend the night in contemplation. The answer comes through dreams or signs, or sometimes just sudden clarity. What kind of question? She was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. I've been thinking about leaving academia, about whether I'm really meant to be a researcher, or whether I'm just hiding behind other people's stories because I'm afraid to live my own. It was the first time I'd heard Sarah express doubt about her path, and it caught me off guard. She'd always seemed so certain, so confident in her choices. What would you do instead? I asked. I don't know. That's the problem. I've spent so long studying how other people find their way that I've forgotten how to find my own. Have you ever had a moment when you realize your friend is struggling with something you never suspected? Looking at Sarah across the fire, I could see the uncertainty she'd been hiding beneath all that academic confidence. The fear that she'd chosen the wrong path, that she was wasting her life on abstract theories whilst missing out on actual living. So ask the question, I said, what's the worst that could happen? She looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. Will you do it with me? I know it's not exactly scientific, but of course. What followed was one of the strangest experiences of my life. Sarah had me help her arrange some additional stones around a compass rose, creating what she called a seeking circle. Then we each took a position on opposite sides of the arrangement, facing inward. The idea is to focus on your question whilst observing the patterns around you, she explained. The stones, the fire, the natural features of the landscape. You're looking for signs, for anything that might provide guidance. I didn't have a question as profound as Sarah's, so I settled on something that had been nagging at me for months. Whether I should give up photography and find a more stable career. It seemed trivial compared to her existential crisis, but it was genuinely bothering me. We sat there in silence for I don't know how long, the rain continuing to fall around us whilst our little circle remained strangely dry. I found myself studying the arrangement of stones, the way the firelight played across their surfaces, the patterns of shadow and light that shifted as the flames danced. And gradually, something began to happen. Not a vision or a voice, nothing dramatic like that. Just a slow shift in perspective, as if I was seeing the landscape and my place in it from a completely different angle. The stones weren't just markers pointing in different directions. They were possibilities, each one representing a different path I could take. And the fire at the center wasn't just providing light and warmth. It was a point of choice, the moment of decision from which all paths radiated. I could see my life spreading out around me like a map, different routes I could follow, different versions of myself I could become. Some paths led to safety and stability, others to adventure and uncertainty. Some were well-traveled, others barely visible, overgrown with the vegetation of doubt and fear. But here's what struck me most. All the paths were valid. There wasn't one right choice, one correct direction. The compass rose wasn't telling me which way to go. It was showing me that I had the power to choose, that any direction could be the right one if I committed to it fully. When I finally looked up, I found Sarah watching me with an expression of wonder. "You felt it too," she said. It wasn't a question. "What is this place?" I asked. "I think it's exactly what the Native Americans said it was. A crossroads, a place where different possibilities converge, where you can see all your potential futures laid out like a map." The rain had stopped whilst we were sitting there, though I hadn't noticed when. The clouds were beginning to break up, revealing glimpses of stars through the gaps. And in that starlight, I could see that the landscape around us had changed. Not dramatically. The trees were still there, the contours of the land were the same, but there were new paths visible now, trails that hadn't been there before, leading off in directions that seemed to promise entirely different adventures. "Do you see them?" Sarah whispered. I nodded. "Which one do you want to take?" She stood up, moving to the edge of our compass rose, and pointed towards a path that led up into hills. "That one calls to me. It looks like it goes towards something real, something I can actually touch and experience rather than just study." "What about your PhD?" "What about it? I can always go back to academia, if I want to. But if I don't try something else now, I might never have the courage to leave." Have you ever had one of those moments when you know your life is about to change completely? Standing there in that strange, liminal space, looking at paths that shouldn't exist but clearly did. I felt like I was balanced on the edge of a cliff, about to jump into an entirely new version of myself. "I'm going to give up corporate photography," I said suddenly. "I'm going to travel, document real stories, real people. Maybe work with indigenous communities, help them tell their own stories instead of having them told by outsiders." Sarah grinned. "That sounds perfect for you, and I know exactly where you should start." She pointed to a different path, one that led in the opposite direction from hers. "That one's yours. I can see it leading to all sorts of interesting places, interesting people." We spent the rest of the night talking about our plans, about the futures we could see opening up before us. The paths remained visible until dawn, when they gradually faded as the ordinary world reasserted itself. But even after they disappeared, I could still feel them there, still sense the possibilities they represented. When we packed up that morning, we were different people than we'd been when we arrived. Sarah never did finish her PhD. She became a travel writer instead, documenting traditional practices around the world not as an academic, but as a participant, someone genuinely seeking to understand rather than just study. I kept my promise to myself as well. I spent the next 3 years traveling, working with indigenous communities throughout the Americas, helping them create their own visual narratives. It wasn't always easy. There were times when I questioned my decision, when the uncertainty and financial instability nearly drove me back to corporate work. But whenever I felt lost, whenever I doubted the path I'd chosen, I would remember that night at the Compass Rose. I would remember the feeling of seeing all possibilities laid out before me, of understanding that there was no single right answer, only choices made with intention and commitment. That's what that place taught me, ultimately. That life isn't about finding the perfect path. It's about choosing a path and then walking it with purpose, remaining open to the signs and synchronicities that guide you along the way. The rain's really coming down now, isn't it? Makes you think about all the crossroads in your own life. All the moments when you had to choose a direction without knowing where it would lead. Makes you wonder whether you're on the right path, whether you've been following your own compass or someone else's expectations. But here's what I learned that night in Iowa. The compass that matters most isn't the one that points north. It's the one that points towards your authentic self, towards a life you're meant to live rather than the one you think you should live. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you find yourself in a place where all the paths are visible at once, where you can see clearly which direction calls to your heart. The trick is having the courage to follow it, even when it leads into unknown territory. Especially when it leads into unknown territory, because that's where the real adventure begins. You know how some memories stick with you, don't you? The ones that make you pause whatever you're doing, just to make sure you're still safe where you are. Well, I've got one of those memories, and it's been with me for nearly 15 years now. Every time I hear rain like this, proper heavy rain that drums against windows and drowns out the world, I'm right back there in those Iowa woods, wishing I'd never left my warm bed in Des Moines. Have you ever been camping in Iowa? I know it's not exactly what people picture when they think of outdoor adventures. Most folks imagine Colorado mountains or California coastlines. But Iowa has its own kind of wilderness, especially up north where the forests get thick and the farmland gives way to something wilder, something that feels forgotten. I was 32 then, working for a consulting firm that had me traveling all over the Midwest. Stressed out of my mind, if I'm being honest. My marriage was falling apart. Work was crushing me, and I hadn't had a proper night's sleep in months. My doctor suggested I take some time off, maybe try something peaceful. Get back to nature, he said. Find yourself again. So there I was, driving north on Highway 35 on a Friday evening in late September. My car packed with camping gear I bought that same afternoon. I'd chosen Backbone State Park. Seemed safe enough, well-maintained. The sort of place where families go for weekend trips. I thought I'd spend a couple of nights under the stars, clear my head, maybe figure out what I wanted to do with my life. The rain started just as I pulled into the park entrance. Not heavy at first, just a gentle patter on the windscreen that made the autumn leaves glisten in my headlights. The ranger station was closed. It was past 8 in the evening, but there was a self-registration board where you could pay for your pitch and mark which site you want on a little map. I chose Site 47, mainly because it was marked as secluded, and I wanted to be alone with my thoughts. The map showed it was about a mile hike from the car park, deeper into the woods than the family-friendly spots near the facilities. Perfect for someone who needed to disconnect completely. Do you know that feeling when you're walking alone in the woods at night? Even with a good torch, the darkness seems to press around a beam of light, making everything beyond it feel infinite and full of possibilities you'd rather not consider. The rain was getting heavier as I made my way down the trail, my rucksack heavy with supplies, the sound of my footsteps muffled by the wet leaves underfoot. Site 47 was exactly what I'd hoped for, a small clearing surrounded by tall pines, with a fire ring in the center and a picnic table that had seen better days. I could barely make out the next campsite through the trees, and that suited me perfectly. I wanted isolation. I wanted silence, apart from the rain and the wind in the branches. Setting up my tent in the rain wasn't exactly the peaceful start I'd envisioned, but I managed it. The steady rhythm of raindrops on the fly sheet was actually quite soothing once I was inside with my sleeping bag, a thermos of coffee, and a paperback novel I'd been meaning to read for months. I must have dozed off around midnight, listening to the rain. What woke me wasn't a sound. It was the absence of sound. The rain had stopped, but it wasn't just that. The woods had gone completely silent. No night birds, no rustle of small animals, no wind in the trees. Just nothing. Have you ever experienced total silence like that? It's unnerving in a way that's hard to describe. Your ears start playing tricks on you, creating phantom sounds just to fill the void. I lay there in my sleeping bag, suddenly wide awake, listening to this oppressive quiet and feeling my heart rate pick up for no reason I could name. That's when I heard the footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling my tent. Not the quick, light steps of a deer or the shuffling of a raccoon. These were measured, purposeful, human footsteps on wet leaves, moving in a wide circle around my campsite. I held my breath, straining to listen. The steps would pause for long moments, then continue, around and around my tent, never coming closer, never moving away, just circling, like someone was studying me, trying to decide something. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is someone there?" The footsteps stopped immediately. I waited, every muscle tense, for response. Nothing came. No voice, no movement, nothing. But somehow, the silence felt different now. Expectant, like whatever was out there was waiting for me to make the next move. I'm not particularly brave, I'll admit that freely. But I'm also not the sort of person who cowers in a tent all night. I unzipped my sleeping bag as quietly as possible and reached for my torch. The zipper on the tent door seemed impossibly loud in the stillness, but I managed to peer outside. Nothing, just dark trees and the gleam of wet leaves of my torch beam. I swept the light around the campsite, illuminating the fire ring, the picnic table, the edge of the forest. Everything looked exactly as it should, exactly as I had left it, but the feeling of being watched was so strong it made my skin crawl. "I know you're there," I said to the darkness. "What do you want?" Still nothing. But as I stood there in the mouth of my tent, torch in hand, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The ground around my tent was soft from the rain, soft enough to show footprints clearly. And there they were, a circle of boot prints in the mud, maybe 10 feet from my tent. Adult-sized boots, the kind you'd wear for hiking or outdoor work. But here's what really frightened me. The prints only went in one direction, a perfect circle around my tent, but no prints leading to where the circle began and none leading away, as if whoever had made them had simply appeared at one point and vanished at another. I'm not a superstitious man, never been. I believe in logical explanations, in things that make sense. But standing there in that silent forest, looking at those impossible footprints, I felt something I'd never experienced before, a deep, primal terror that seemed to bypass my rational mind entirely. That's when I heard the whisper. It was so soft I almost missed it, barely audible over the drip of water from the trees. But it was there, a voice calling my name, my actual name, spoken in a tone so familiar it made me spin around, searching for the source. "David." It said again, and this time I recognized the voice. It was my father's voice. My father, who'd been dead for 3 years. You have to understand, this wasn't some vague resemblance or wishful thinking. It was his voice exactly as I remembered it. The slight Yorkshire accent he never quite lost after moving to America, the way he'd say my name when he was proud of something I'd done. Unmistakable. "Dad," I whispered into the darkness, feeling foolish even as I said it. "David, come here, son." The voice was coming from deeper in the woods, past the ring of footprints, beyond the reach of my torch beam. Every instinct I had screamed at me not to follow it, not to leave the relative safety in my campsite. But it was my father's voice, and some part of me, the part that had never stopped being his little boy, wanted desperately to obey. I took a step forward, then another. The torch beam revealed nothing but trees and undergrowth, but the voice kept calling, always just ahead of me, always just out of sight. "This way, David," I've been waiting for you. Have you ever followed a voice into a dark forest? Have you ever felt that pull between what you know is safe and what some deeper part of you desperately wants to believe? I followed that voice for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, moving deeper into the woods, further from my tent, further from any hope of help if I needed it. The trees seemed to close in around me as I walked, their branches forming a canopy so thick that barely any starlight could penetrate. My torch became my only lifeline, a small circle of reality in an increasingly surreal world. And all the while, my father's voice led me on, always encouraging, always just ahead. Almost there, son, just a little further. I should have stopped. I should have turned around and run back to my tent, packed up my gear, and driven straight home. But grief does strange things to people, doesn't it? And I'd never properly grieved my father. His death had been sudden, a heart attack at work. And I'd been so busy handling the funeral arrangements and support of my mother that I'd never really dealt with the loss. So I followed the voice deeper into the Iowa woods, my torch beam dancing over moss-covered logs and twisted roots, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. That's when I saw the light ahead. Not electric light, something warmer, more organic. Firelight, flickering through the trees like a beacon. And with it came the smell with smoke and something else, something that made my mouth water despite my fear. Cooking food, bacon, maybe, and coffee brewing. The voice stopped calling, but I could see the light clearly now, maybe 50 meters ahead through the trees. I moved toward it carefully, tried to make as little noise as possible, some survival instinct finally kicking in to suggest that maybe, just maybe, I was walking into something I wouldn't be able to walk out of. What I found in that clearing will stay with me until the day I die. It was a campsite, but not like any I'd ever seen. The tent was old-fashioned, made of heavy canvas like something from the 1940s. A fire crackled in a ring of stones, with a coffee pot hanging from a makeshift tripod and strips of bacon sizzling in a cast-iron pan. Everything looked perfectly normal, perfectly welcoming, except for one thing. There was no one there. The bacon was cooking, the coffee was brewing, but the campsite was completely empty. No sign of whoever had lit the fire or prepared the food. Just an empty chair beside the fire, positioned as if someone had just stepped away for a moment and would be right back. "Hello?" I called out, louder this time. "Is anyone here?" My voice echoed strangely in the clearing, seeming to hang in the air longer than it should have. And in that echo, I heard something that made my knees go weak. Laughter. Multiple voices, laughing together like old friends sharing a joke. But there was still no one there. The laughter came from everywhere and nowhere, surrounding me without any visible source. I backed away from the fire, every nerve in my body screaming danger. But as I turned to leave, I saw something that stopped me cold. On the ground beside the empty chair, illuminated by the firelight, was a newspaper. I could make out the headline clearly. "Local man dies in industrial accident." Even from a distance, I could see the photo accompanying the article. It was my father, but that was impossible. My father hadn't died in an industrial accident. He'd had a heart attack, and the newspaper looked fresh, as if it had been printed that very day. None of it made sense, but there it was, physical evidence of something that couldn't be real. I don't remember making the decision to run. One moment I was staring at that impossible newspaper, and the next I was crashing through the underbrush, my torch beam swinging wildly as I desperately tried to find my way back to my campsite. Branches whipped at my face, roots caught my feet, and behind me, that terrible laughter followed, growing louder and more distorted with each step I took. Have you ever been truly lost? Not just unsure of your direction, but completely, utterly lost, with no idea which way leads to safety? That's how I felt as I stumbled through those woods, the sound of laughter echoing around me like something from a nightmare. Every tree looked the same. Every shadow seemed to hide something watching me, and my torch beam seemed to be getting dimmer with each passing moment. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, finally collapsing against a large oak tree to catch my breath. The laughter had stopped, but the silence that replaced it was somehow worse. I sat there gasping, trying to make sense of what I'd seen, trying to convince myself it had all been some sort of hallucination brought on by stress and grief. That's when I noticed the smell. Smoke. With smoke, just like what I'd smelled at the impossible campsite. But this was closer, much closer. I looked around frantically and realized I could see a faint orange glow through the trees, maybe 20 meters away. Another campfire. Another campsite. My first instinct was to run in the opposite direction, but something stopped me. A sound I recognized. The crackle of bacon in a pan, the bubble of coffee brewing, and underneath it, barely audible, the sound of someone humming. A tune I recognized. A lullaby my father used to sing to me when I was small. Against every rational thought in my head, I found myself moving towards a light. This campsite was different from the first. More modern, more familiar. The tent was the same model as mine. The gear arranged just as I might have arranged it. And sitting beside the fire, with his back to me, was a figure in clothes I recognized. My father's camping jacket. The blue fleece he'd worn on our fishing trips when I was a teenager. "Dad!" I whispered, barely trusting my own voice. The figure didn't turn around, but he stopped humming. Slowly, deliberately, he reached the coffee pot and poured 2 cups, setting one on the ground beside his chair without looking back. "I've been waiting for you, David," he said in that familiar Yorkshire accent. "Sit down, son. We need to talk. What would you have done, faced with what seemed to be your dead father, sitting by a campfire in the middle of nowhere, inviting you to join him for coffee?" Every rational part of my mind was screaming that this was impossible, that I was having some sort of breakdown. But the voice was so real, so perfectly him, that I found myself moving forward despite my fear. I didn't sit down, though. I stood just at the edge of the firelight, close enough to see that the figure was exactly my father's height and build, wearing his clothes, moving with his familiar gestures. But I couldn't see his face, and something deep in my gut told me I didn't want to. "You're not real," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "My father is dead." The figure chuckled. It was my father's laugh exactly. "Death's not quite what you think it is, son. Not around here, anyway." "What do you mean?" He gestured vaguely at the surrounding woods. "These forests have been here a long time, David. Long before the state parks. Long before the settlers. Long before anyone bothered to draw lines on maps and call them boundaries. Some places collect things. Memories, voices, souls that can't find their way to wherever they're supposed to go." I took a step back, but he continued as if he hadn't noticed. "I've been trapped here since I died, son. Trapped by my own regret, by all the things I never said to you, all the times I should have been there and wasn't. The forest feeds on that kind of pain, uses it to keep spirits like me bound to this place. The coffee cup sat steaming on the ground between us, and I could smell it clearly. My father's preferred blend, strong and black. But I didn't move to pick it up. "If you're really my father," I said carefully, "prove it. Tell me something only he would know." The figure was quiet for a long moment. and I could hear the fire crackling, the distant sound of wind in the trees. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, sadder. You were 7 years old when you broke your arm falling out of the old apple tree in our back garden. You were terrified I'd be angry about you climbing when I told you not to, so you hid in the shed for 3 hours before your mother found you. When I came home and saw you sitting there with your arm all swollen and wrong, I didn't say a word about the disobedience. I just scooped you up and drove you to hospital, and I sat beside your bed all night afterwards, wondering how I could be a better father to a boy brave enough to endure that much pain rather than disappoint me. My eyes filled with tears. It was true, every word. A memory I'd never shared with anyone, not even my wife. Only my father could have known those details. Dad, I whispered, and took a step toward the fire. That's when he turned around. The face that looked back at me was my father's, but wrong in ways that made my vision blur and my stomach lurch. It was him, but decayed, rotted, with empty sockets where his eyes should have been, and a smile that stretched too wide across features that seemed to shift and writhe in the firelight. "Come closer, son," he said in that familiar voice. But now I could hear something else underneath, a wet, hungry sound like something feeding. "Come sit with your old dad. We have so much time to make up for." I ran. I don't remember the details of that run. Just branches tearing at my clothes, my torch beam swinging wildly, and behind me, that terrible voice calling my name over and over, sometimes my father's Yorkshire accent, sometimes other voices I recognized. My mother, calling me in for dinner. My first girlfriend, saying she loved me. My wife, back when things between us were good. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, an endless maze of trees and shadows and voices that promised comfort but delivered only horror. I ran until I thought my heart would burst, until my legs could barely carry me, until I was sobbing with exhaustion and terror. And then, suddenly, I was back at my campsite. My tent stood exactly where I'd left it, my car keys still in my pocket, everything normal and real and wonderfully mundane. I collapsed beside my tent, gasping, shaking, trying to convince myself that what I'd experienced was just a nightmare brought on by stress and an unfamiliar environment. But as I knelt there in the dirt, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. There were wet footprints leading from the forest to my tent. Fresh footprints, still glistening in my torch beam. And they weren't just mine. There were other prints too. Bare feet, different sizes, some that looked like they might have been made by children. All leading to my tent. All stopping just inches from where I knelt. I looked up slowly, sweeping my torch beam in a wide circle around the campsite. At first, I saw nothing. Then, just at the edge of the light, I caught a glimpse of movement, a figure standing between the trees. Too far away to make out clearly, but close enough that I could see it was watching me. As I stared, more figures emerged from the forest. Dozens of them, standing silent and still among the trees, all facing my campsite, all watching me with an attention that felt hungry and patient and utterly inhuman. I didn't pack my tent. I didn't collect my gear. I grabbed my car keys and ran for the parking area, crashing through the undergrowth like a madman, not caring about the noise or the branches that tore at my skin. Behind me, I could hear them following, not running, just walking steadily, their footsteps keeping perfect time like some sort of funeral march. My car started on the first try, and I've never been more grateful for anything in my life. I reversed out of that parking space, so fast I nearly hit a tree, then floored the accelerator down the park road, my headlights sweeping over empty campsites and silent forest. But in my rear view mirror, I could see them, standing at the edge of the road, watching me drive away. dozens of figures silhouetted against the darkness, perfectly still, perfectly patient, waiting. I drove straight through the night. Didn't stop until I reached Des Moines. Didn't feel safe until I was locked in my own flat with every light turned on. I called in sick for the next week. Spent the time researching everything I could find about Backbone State Park and the surrounding area. What I found didn't help my peace of mind. There had been disappearances over the years. Campers who'd gone into those woods and never come out. Search parties had found abandoned campsites, personal belongings, even cars in parking areas, but never the people themselves. The Park Service blamed it on the terrain, on people getting lost and falling into ravines or streams. Natural causes. They said, nothing supernatural about it. But I found older records too, from before the park was established. Native American legends about spirits in the forest, about places where the dead couldn't rest, about trees that whispered names in the darkness. Settlers' accounts of strange lights and voices calling from the woods, of people who went hunting and came back different. I never went camping again. Never went back to Iowa, if I could help it. But sometimes on nights like this when the rain is heavy and the world feels quiet and contained, I find myself thinking about those woods, about my father's voice calling my name, about all those figures standing silent among the trees. And I wonder, if I'd stayed, if I'd sat down beside that fire and drunk that coffee with whatever was wearing my father's face, would I have found some sort of peace? Would I have been able to say goodbye properly, to heal that wound that his sudden death had left in my heart? Or would I have become one of those figures myself, standing at the edge of someone else's campsite, watching and waiting and calling out in a voice that sounds like home but leads only to darkness? I suppose I'll never know. But every time I hear rain like this, every time the world goes quiet and still, I remember that night in the Iowa woods. And I remember the lesson I learned there, that sometimes the things we want most desperately to be true are the very things that will destroy us. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. Some voices, once followed, lead only to places we were never meant to go. The rain's getting heavier now, isn't it? Listen to it drumming against the windows, drowning out the sounds of the normal world. Makes you think about all the places where the rain is falling tonight, all the dark forests and empty campsites where other stories might be unfolding. Makes you wonder what voices might be calling through the darkness, and whether you'd be strong enough to ignore them if they sounded like someone you'd lost. I hope you never have to find out. You know that feeling when you're absolutely knackered, but sleep won't come? When your mind keeps churning over the same thoughts, the same worries, until you feel like you're going mad. That's where I was 3 summers ago, working double shift at the plant in Cedar Rapids, trying to keep my head above water after the divorce. The rain tonight reminds me of that weekend in August when I finally cracked. My supervisor had been on at me for weeks about taking some time off. Said I looked like death warmed over and was making mistakes that could cost people their jobs. Fair enough, I suppose. I'd been working 16-hour days for 2 months straight, living on energy drinks and spite. So I threw some gear in my car and drove north to Backbone State Park. Seemed like the sort of place where I could get some proper rest. Maybe remember what it felt like to be human again instead of just another cog in a machine. Have you ever driven through rural Iowa at night? Miles and miles of farmland, broken up by patches of forest that look black as ink in your headlights. It's peaceful during the day, but at night, there's something unsettling about all that emptiness. Makes you realize how alone you really are out there. I arrived at the park just as it was getting dark. Rain starting to spatter my windscreen. The ranger station was closed, but there was a self-service board where you could register for a site. I picked number 63. mainly because it was marked as being away from the main camping area. I wanted solitude, wanted to be somewhere I couldn't hear other people's conversations or children playing. The hike to Site 63 took about 20 minutes, following a narrow trail that wound deeper into the forest. My torch beam picked out wet leaves and twisted roots, the occasional flash of eyes from some small creature scurrying away from the light. The rain was coming down harder now, turning the path slippery and treacherous. When I finally reached the campsite, I was soaked through and in no mood for faff of setting up camp in the rain. But the site was perfect for what I needed. Completely isolated, surrounded by tall pines that creaked and swayed in the wind. The nearest campsite was marked as being over half a mile away through the forest. I managed to get my tent up and crawled inside, stripping off my wet clothes and pulling on dry gear. The sound of rain on the fly sheet was actually quite soothing, and for the first time in weeks, I felt some of the tension leaving my shoulders. I made myself a cup of tea on my camping stove and settled in with a book, thinking I might actually get a decent night's sleep for once. That's when I heard the radio. It was faint at first, barely audible over the rain. A crackling, static-filled transmission that seemed to be coming from somewhere nearby. I assumed it was another camper, maybe someone with a weather radio checking the forecast. But as I listened more carefully, I realized the voices weren't talking about weather. Subject is approximately 6 feet tall, brown hair, driving a dark blue Vauxhall Corsa, registration number. I sat up straighter, suddenly alert. That sounded like police radio traffic. But what were the police doing out here in the middle of the night? And why was the signal so clear when we were miles from the nearest town? The transmission continued, and what I heard next made my blood run cold. They were describing me, my height, my car, even my registration number. Talking about me like I was some sort of suspect, some sort of threat that needed to be contained. Last seen entering Backbone State Park at approximately 9:45 p.m. Considered dangerous. Approach with caution. Dangerous? What the bloody hell were they talking about? I'd never so much as had a parking ticket in my life. There had to be some sort of mistake, some confusion with someone else's details. I unzipped my tent door and peered out into the rain, tried to see if there were any police vehicles or officers nearby. The forest was dark and silent apart from the steady drum of rain on leaves. No blue lights, no voices, nothing to indicate any kind of police presence. But the radio chatter continued, growing clearer and more urgent. All units. We have reports of the suspect camping at Site 63. Requesting backup for apprehension. Subject may be armed and is not to be approached alone. Site 63. My site. They were talking about me, and they were coming. My heart started hammering in my chest as I tried to make sense of what was happening. Armed? I didn't even own a bloody penknife, let alone a weapon. And what was I supposed to have done that made me so dangerous? I grabbed my torch and stepped out of the tent, rain immediately soaking through my jumper. The radio voices seemed to be coming from all directions now. Overlapping transmissions that painted a picture of a massive manhunt closing in on my position. Unit 7 in position on the North Trail. Unit 12 covering the eastern approach. Command, we have eyes on the suspect's vehicle. No sign of movement. Were you ever a child who played hide and seek? Do you remember that heart-pounding moment when you knew you were about to be found? When you could hear the footsteps getting closer and there was nowhere left to run? That's exactly how I felt standing there in the rain, listening to those radio voices coordinate what sounded like a military operation designed to capture me. But here's the thing that made it even more terrifying. I couldn't see anyone. No torches moving through the trees, no vehicles, No officers calling out commands. Just voices on a radio that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Suspect has exited his tent. Repeat, suspect is mobile and appears to be listening to our transmissions. How could they know that? How could they see me when I couldn't see them? I spun around, shining my torch in every direction, but the beam just disappeared into the darkness between the trees. If there were police officers out there, they were invisible. All units, be advised suspect is acting erratically, maybe under the influence of controlled substances. Negative, command, subject appears alert and responsive. Recommend immediate action before he attempts to flee. That did it. Whatever was happening, whatever bizarre mistake had led to this situation, I wasn't going to stand around waiting to find out. I ducked back into my tent, grabbed my car keys and wallet, and started moving toward the trail that led back to the car park. The radio chatter followed me, the voices growing more excited as they tracked my movement. Suspect is heading towards the parking area. All units converge on grid reference. I started running, my torch beam bouncing wildly as I crashed through the undergrowth. The trail seemed different somehow, longer than it had been on my way in. Branches that I didn't remember reached out to catch my jacket. Roots that hadn't been there before sent me stumbling. Unit 5, cut him off at the bridge. Unit 9, take position at the vehicle. Bridge? What bridge? I'd crossed a small stream on my way to the campsite, but there hadn't been a proper bridge. Just stepping stones and a fallen log. But as I rounded a bend in the trail, there it was, a wooden footbridge spanning a creek that looked much wider and deeper than I remembered. And standing at the far end of the bridge, silhouetted against the darkness, was a figure in what looked like a police uniform. I stopped running, breathing hard, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure didn't move, didn't call out, just stood there blocking my path like some sort of checkpoint. The radio chatter had gone quiet, replaced by the sound of rain and my own ragged breathing. "Officer," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's been some sort of mistake. I think you've got me confused with someone else." The figure turned its head towards me, and I caught a glimpse of a face that was wrong in ways I couldn't quite process. Too pale, too angular, with eyes that reflected my torch beam like an animal's. David Morrison. It said in a voice that sounded like it was coming through a bad radio connection. "You're under arrest for crimes against the natural order." Crimes against the natural order? What the hell did that even mean? I took a step backwards, every instinct screaming that I needed to get away from this person, this thing, whatever it was. "I haven't committed any crimes," I said, surprised by how calm I sounded. "I'm just here camping. I work at the plant in Cedar Rapids. I pay my taxes. I've never hurt anyone." The figure tilted its head, and I heard that radio static again, coming from somewhere inside its uniform. David Morrison, 34 years old, recently divorced, works excessive hours to avoid dealing with emotional trauma. Subject has been selected for processing due to elevated stress levels and potential for psychological breakdown. Processing? Selected? This was getting more bizarre by the minute. I took another step back, keeping my torch trained on the figure, trying to see if there were others nearby. Processing for what? I asked. The thing that looked like a police officer smiled, and its teeth were too sharp, too numerous. Integration with the park security system. We're always looking for new personnel. David. People who understand what it means to work long hours, to sacrifice everything for the job. You'd fit right in. That's when I noticed the other figures. They emerged from the trees on both sides of the trail, all wearing what looked like police uniforms. all moving with that same wrong mechanical gait. Some of them carried torches that cast no light. Others had radios that crackled with the voices of the dead. And they all had that same too pale face, those same reflective eyes. "Welcome to the night shift, David," the first figure said. "It never ends, but at least you'll never have to worry about overtime pay again." Have you ever been surrounded by something that your mind refuses to accept as real? Every rational part of my brain was screaming that this was impossible, that I was having some sort of breakdown brought on by exhaustion and stress. But my body knew better. My body was already moving, already turning away from those awful figures, already running back into the forest. I heard them following, their radios crackling with coordinates and tactical updates, their footsteps keeping perfect time like a military unit. But when I looked back over my shoulder, all I could see was darkness. They were there. I could hear them, could feel it behind me, but they remained invisible like shadows cast by a light I couldn't see. The forest seemed to shift around me as I ran, paths appearing and disappearing, landmarks changing when I wasn't looking directly at them. What should have been a 20-minute hike back to my car became an endless maze of trees and streams and trails that led nowhere. Subject is attempting to evade capture. Came the radio voice, "Closer now. Recommend switching to Containment Protocol 7. I didn't want to know what Containment Protocol 7 involved. I kept running, branches whipping in my face, my torch battery getting dimmer with each passing minute. The rain was coming down harder now, turning the ground beneath my feet into slippery mud that sent me sliding down slopes I didn't remember climbing. That's when I saw the light ahead. Not torchlight, something warmer, more stable. Electric light, coming from what looked like a building nestled between the trees. As I got closer, I could make out details. A small cabin with windows glowing yellow, smoke rising from a chimney, a sign by the door that read Park Ranger Station, Emergency Services. I'd found help. Whatever was happening, whatever those things in the forest were, a park ranger would know what to do. I stumbled up to the door and pounded on it with both fists. "Help!" I shouted. "Please, I need help. There are people chasing me, police officers, but they're not right." The door opened immediately, as if someone had been waiting for me. A man in a park ranger uniform stood there, middle-aged and reassuring, with kind eyes and a concerned expression. Come in," he said. "Usher me inside. You look terrible. What's happened?" I stumbled into the warm cabin, dripping rainwater on the wooden floor. The interior was exactly what you'd expect from a ranger station. Maps on the walls, radio equipment, a desk covered with paperwork. Normal, mundane, wonderfully real. There are these people. I gasped, trying to catch my breath. They look like police officers, but they're not. They're saying I'm under arrest for something I didn't do, talking about processing and integration. I think they're trying to kidnap me. The ranger closed the door and locked it, then guided me to a chair by a small heater. "You're safe now," he said. "Let me get you something hot to drink, and you can tell me everything." He moved to a kitchenette and started making tea, and I felt some of the terror leaving my system. This was normal. This was help. Whatever was happening out there in the forest, I'd found sanctuary. "Have you had other reports?" I asked. "Other people being chased by fake police officers?" The ranger didn't answer immediately. He finished making the tea and brought it over, setting it on a small table beside my chair. That's when I noticed his name tag. Officer Morrison. It read, Night Shift Supervisor. Morrison, my surname. I looked up at his face. really looked at it for the first time, and saw my own features staring back at me. My own eyes, my own nose, my own mouth, but aged, weathered, with something cold and hungry lurking behind the familiar features. "Welcome to your new position, David," he said in my own voice. "I've been doing this job for quite some time now, and I think you'll find it fulfilling." I tried to stand, tried to run, but found that I couldn't move. The chair seemed to be holding me. Not physically, but in some other way, as if my will to resist was simply draining away like water from a broken cup. "You see," the thing with my face continued, "the park needs security, real security, not just weekend rangers who clock off at 5 and go home to their families. We need people who understand commitment, who know what it means to work through the night, every night forever." The radio on his desk crackled to life, and I heard my own voice coming through the speaker. "All units. Suspect has been contained. Beginning integration process now. How long have you been here?" I managed to ask, though speaking felt like moving through treacle. He smiled, and it was my smile but wrong, stretched too wide and lasting too long. "Time works differently here, David. I came for a weekend camping trip in 1987, just like you, stressed out, overworked, looking for some peace and quiet. The park offered me a job, permanent employment with excellent benefits. No sick days, no holidays, no retirement. Just work, endless work, keeping the forest safe and secure. Safe from what? From people like us, David. People who don't understand that some places require constant vigilance, constant sacrifice. People who think they can just wander into the wilderness and take what they need without giving anything back." The warmth was leaving my body now, starting from my extremities and working inward. I could feel something changing, something fundamental about who I was beginning to shift and alter. "The integration process is quite painless," the other me said, settling into the chair behind the desk. "You'll retain most of your memories, most of your personality, but your priorities will become clearer, more focused. You'll understand that the work is all that matters, that everything else is just distraction." I tried to fight it, tried to hold on to who I was, but it was like trying to cup water in my hands. My old life, my old concerns, my old identity. It all seemed so small and insignificant compared to the vast, patient purpose that was settling into my mind. "That's it," he said encouragingly. "Let it happen. Accept your new role. You'll be much happier once you stop fighting it." And you know what the terrible thing was? He was right. As the change completed itself, as I felt my old self dissolving and reforming into something new and purposeful, I did feel happier. The stress, the exhaustion, the crushing weight of trying to hold my life together, it all fell away, replaced by a clear, simple objective: protect the park, maintain order, process new recruits when they arrive. I stood up, my new uniform materializing around me as I did so, and walked to the radio. Time to get back to work. "All units. This is Unit Morrison reporting for duty. What's our status on new arrivals?" "We have a family setting up camp at Site 47. Came the reply. 2 adults, 2 children. They look tired, stressed, good candidates for processing." I checked my equipment, torch, radio, the various tools of my new trade. Everything was in order. Everything was as it should be. "Copy that," I said into the radio. "I'm on my way." But as I reached for the door handle, something made me pause. A fragment of memory, a ghost of who I used to be. For just a moment, I remember what it felt like to be human, to be afraid, to want nothing more than a peaceful night's sleep in the wilderness. The feeling passed quickly, subsumed into my new purpose, but it left me with something I hadn't expected. A tiny spark of pity for the people I was about to meet, the people who would soon join our ranks. They wouldn't understand at first. They'd run, they'd fight, they'd try to escape. But eventually, they'd see that this was better. That working the night shift, keeping the forest safe, was so much more fulfilling than whatever small, desperate lives they'd been living before. I opened the door and stepped out into the rain, my radio crackling with updates from my colleagues. Somewhere out there in the darkness, a family was setting up their tent, thinking they'd found a place of peace and solitude. They had no idea how right they were. The rain's still coming down, isn't it? Drumming against your windows, washing the world clean. Makes you think about all the people out there tonight, all the campers and hikers and weekend adventurers seeking a bit of nature, a bit of quiet. Makes you wonder how many of them will find exactly what they're looking for, and how many of them will find something else entirely, something that's been waiting patiently in the darkness, always ready to offer steady employment to those who've forgotten what it means to truly rest. Sweet dreams. Do you ever get that feeling when you're scrolling through old photos on your phone? That strange mix of nostalgia and melancholy, like you're looking at someone else's life? I was doing exactly that 4 years ago, sitting in my bedsit in Manchester, when I came across a picture I'd forgotten I had. It was from a family camping trip when I was 12, my parents, my older sister Emma, and me standing around a campfire somewhere in America. We'd emigrated from England when I was 10, spent 3 years in Iowa before my father's job brought us back to the UK. Those American years felt like a dream sometimes, especially after my parents died in that car crash when I was 25. The photos showed us at something called Backbone State Park, all of us grinning at the camera, marshmallows on sticks, the sort of perfect family moment that makes you ache for simpler times. Emma had died 2 years after our parents. Cancer, quick and brutal. So I was the only one left who remembered that trip. That's what made me book the flight to Iowa that October. 31 years old, recently made redundant, feeling like I was drifting through life without any real connections. I thought maybe going back to that park, recreating that camping trip, might help me feel closer to them somehow. Give me some perspective on what I wanted to do with my life. Ridiculous, really, but grief makes you do odd things, doesn't it? The flight to Cedar Rapids was delayed by storms, and by the time I picked up my rental car and drove north to the park, it was already getting dark. Rain was starting to patter on the windscreen. Proper Iowa weather, just like I remember from childhood. The kind of rain that seems to go on forever, turning everything green and lush and slightly mysterious. I'd done my research online, found the exact campsite where we'd stayed all those years ago. Site 29, tucked away in a section of the park that was quieter than the main camping areas. The website said it accommodated up to 6 people, perfect for families, with easy access to hiking trails and the lake. The self-registration process was the same as I remembered. Fill out a form, stick your payment in an envelope, choose your site on the map. Simple and trusting, very American. I selected site 29 and drove through the winding park roads, my headlights picking out familiar landmarks. The old bridge over the creek, the trail marker for Devil's Backbone, the picnic area where we'd eaten lunch that last day before heading home. Everything looked smaller than I remembered, the way childhood places always do. But the feeling was still there, that sense of being somewhere special, somewhere removed from the ordinary world. Site 29 was exactly as it had been in the photo, a circular clearing surrounded by tall pines, with a fire ring in the center and a picnic table that looked like it might have been the same one from 20 years ago. I could almost see us there, Mum bustling about with camping gear, Dad trying to light the fire, Emma and me bickering over who got which tent. Have you ever been back to a place from your childhood? There's something unsettling about it, isn't there? The way your adult mind tries to overlay present reality on childhood memories, creating this strange double vision where past and present seem to exist simultaneously. I set up my tent in the same spot where our family tent had been, built a fire in the same ring, even bought the same brand of marshmallows we'd roasted that night. It felt silly and sentimental, but also oddly comforting. For the first time in months, I wasn't thinking about job applications or mortgage payments or the general mess my life had become. The rain was getting heavier as I settled in for the evening, drumming against my tent fly in a rhythm that was almost hypnotic. I brought along some old family photos, including that one from the camping trip, and I spread them out on the picnic table under my torch beam, trying to match up the background details with what I could see around me. That's when I heard the voices. Children's voices, laughing and calling to each other somewhere nearby. My first thought was that there must be another family camping close by. Kids playing some sort of game despite the rain and the lateness of the hour. But as I listened more carefully, something about the voices seemed familiar. One of them sounded like Emma. Not Emma as an adult, but Emma as she'd been at 14. That particular tone she'd get when she was excited about something high and clear and full of life. The other voice was harder to place, but reminded me of myself at 12, back when my voice was still changing and would crack at unpredictable moments. I stood up from the picnic table, straining to hear over the rain. The voices were coming from deeper in the campsite, past the fire ring, near the edge of the forest where the trees grew thick and dark. "Emma?" I called out, feeling ridiculous even as I said it. "Is someone there?" The laughter stopped immediately, replaced by the sound of rain and wind in the branches. I waited, listening, but heard nothing more. Just my imagination, I told myself. The familiar voices were just my mind playing tricks, overlaying childhood memories onto random sounds in the forest. But as I turned back to the picnic table, I saw something that made me freeze. There were more photos spread out than I remembered putting there. The original family photos were still there, but now there were others, pictures I'd never seen before, but which were clearly from the same camping trip. More angles of our campsite, more shots of my family around the fire, more moments from that weekend I thought were lost forever. I picked up one of the new photos with trembling hands. It showed Emma and me playing some sort of game at the edge of the campsite, both of us grinning at the camera. I remember the game. We'd been pretending to be explorers, mapping the forest around our campsite, making up stories about the creatures that lived in the trees. But I didn't remember anyone taking this photo. My parents had been the only ones with a camera, and in this picture, I could see both of them in the background, sitting by the fire. So who had taken the shot? I looked through the other new photos, my confusion growing with each one. They were definitely from our camping trip. Same clothes, same weather, same campsite. But they showed moments I didn't remember, angles that shouldn't have been possible, perspectives that suggested someone else had been there with us, someone who'd been documenting our family weekend without us knowing. The strangest photo was the last one. It showed all four of us gathered around the fire, but we were looking off to one side, towards something outside the frame. Our expressions were odd, not frightened exactly, but surprised, curious, as if we were seeing something unexpected. And there, just visible at the edge of the photo, was the shadow of whoever had taken the picture, a fifth person, someone who'd been there, but wasn't in any of my memories. Do you remember now? I spun around so fast I knocked over my torch, plunging the campsite into darkness. The voice had come from right behind me, close enough that I should have felt breath on my neck. It was Emma's voice, not the child's voice I'd heard earlier, but Emma as an adult, as she'd been just before she died, warm and familiar and utterly impossible. "Emma?" I whispered into the darkness, my hands shaking as I fumbled for my torch. "You always were slow to catch on, little brother." I found the torch and switched it on, sweeping the beam around the campsite. Nothing, just rain and trees and the scattered photos on the picnic table. But I could feel her presence, could sense her standing just outside the circle of light, watching me with that patient amusement she'd always had when I was being particularly thick. "This isn't real," I said aloud, as much to convince myself as to address whoever or whatever was speaking to me. "You're dead. You died 2 years ago. Death's more complicated than you think, Michael, especially here." I'd almost forgotten she used to call me Michael instead of Mike. Our parents had always used a shortened version, but Emma had insisted on the full name, said it sounded more distinguished. Hearing it now, in her voice, made something inside my chest clench with longing and terror in equal measure. "Where are you?" I asked, still sweeping the torch beam around the campsite. "I can hear you, but I can't see you. You're not looking in the right place. You never did, even when we were children." The torch beam caught something at the edge of the campsite, near the tree line. A figure standing perfectly still, just at the boundary between light and shadow. As I focused the beam, the figure became clearer. It was Emma, but not as she'd been when she died. This was Emma at 14, exactly as she'd appeared in those old photos, wearing the same clothes she'd worn on our camping trip 20 years ago. She was smiling at me with that familiar mix of affection and exasperation. "Hello, Michael. You look terrible. Still not taking care of yourself, I see." I took a step towards her, then stopped. Every rational part of my mind was screaming that this was impossible, that I was having some sort of breakdown brought on by stress and grief and too much nostalgia. But she looked so real, so perfectly herself, that I found myself smiling back despite my fear. "How are you here?" I asked. "How is any of this possible?" "The same way you're here, I suppose. This place, it holds on to things. Memories, moments, people who were happy here. We never really left, Michael. None of US did. None of us." She gestured toward the forest behind her, and I saw them, my parents, emerging from between the trees, looking exactly as they had in those old photos. Dad in his favorite camping jumper, Mom with her hair tied back in the practical style she always wore outdoors. Both of them smiling at me with expressions of pure joy, as if they'd been waiting years for this moment. "We've been here the whole time," Mom said, her voice carrying clearly despite the rain. "Waiting for you to come back, waiting for the family to be complete again. Have you ever wanted something so desperately that you'd accept any version of it, no matter how impossible?" Standing there in that rain-soaked campsite, looking at my dead family gathered at the edge of firelight, I felt that familiar ache of loss begin to ease for the first time in years. "But you're dead," I said, though the words fell hollow. "All of you. I went to your funerals." "Bodies die," Dad said in his practical way. "But families are stronger than that. Especially families that were truly happy together, even if only for a short time. We were happy here, weren't we, Michael?" Emma asked. "That weekend, that was the last time we were all truly happy together, before everything started to fall apart." She was right. That camping trip had been just before Dad's job stress really started affecting him, before Mom began showing the first signs of the depression that would plague her later years, before Emma and I grew apart the way siblings do as they get older. It had been a perfect weekend, a moment of pure family harmony that I treasured all my life. "Come closer," Mom said, extending her hand towards me. "Come and sit with us properly. We got so much to catch up on." I took a step forward, then another. They looked so real, so warm and welcoming. After years of loneliness, years of feeling like I was drifting through life without any real connections, the idea of being with my family again was almost irresistible. But something made me stop. A memory, triggered by the way the firelight was dancing across their faces. I'd seen that exact same play of light and shadow before in one of the photos on the picnic table. The strange photo that showed all of us looking toward something outside the frame. I turned back to the picnic table, keeping my torch beam steady on my family, but reaching behind me for the photographs. When I found the one I was looking for, I held it up next to the torch, comparing it to what I was seeing. It was identical. The positions, the expressions, the way the shadows fell. Everything was exactly the same as in that 20-year-old photograph, as if this moment had been captured before, as if it had been waiting here all this time for me to step back into it. "You remember now," Emma said, and there was something different in her voice. Still loving, still familiar, but with an undertone I didn't recognize. "You remember who took that photo." And suddenly I did remember, not clearly, not with the sharp focus of normal memory, but like something recalled from a dream. There had been someone else on that camping trip. Someone who'd been with us but separate from our family unit. Someone who'd watched us and photographed us and made suggestions about where we should go and what we should do. A park ranger, I thought, or maybe just another camper who'd been friendly and helpful. Someone who'd seemed perfectly normal at the time, but who, looking back, had been just a little too interested in our family, a little too eager to be involved in our activities. "He's still here, you know," Dad said, following my train of thought. "Still taking care of the families who come to visit, still helping them stay together the way they should." The rain was getting heavier now, drumming against the trees with increasing intensity. My family stood there at the edge of the firelight, perfectly dry despite the downpour, still smiling at me with expressions of love and welcome. "All you have to do is step forward," Mom said gently. "Just join us by the fire, and we can be together again, forever this time. No more jobs to worry about, no more bills to pay, no more loneliness. Just family the way it should be." It was everything I dreamed of since they died. The chance to undo the last 15 years of loss and grief. To go back to that perfect weekend when we'd all been happy together. All I had to do was walk toward them, accept their embrace, and let whatever force had preserved them here do the same for me. But something held me back. Maybe it was the way they stayed perfectly still while they spoke, like actors hitting their marks. Maybe it was the fact that they cast no shadows despite standing right next to the fire. Or maybe it was a growing certainty that accepting their offer would mean never leaving this campsite, never growing or changing or experiencing anything beyond this single preserved moment. What about the others? I asked, the other families who came here, what happened to them? For the first time, my family's expressions changed. The smiles faltered slightly, and I saw something else behind their eyes. Not malice, exactly, but a kind of desperate hunger. They stayed, Emma said simply. They chose to stay with the people they loved, in the place where they'd been happiest. Just like we're choosing to stay. Just like you can choose to stay. But what if I want to leave? What if I want to go back to my life? The silence stretched out between us, broken only by the sound of rain on leaves. When Dad finally spoke, his voice was different, flatter, less warm. "Why would you want to go back, Michael? What's waiting for you out there? A redundancy, a bedsit, no family, no real friends. You're 31 years old, and you've accomplished nothing meaningful. At least here, you'd be part of something, part of us." His words stung because they were true. My life outside this campsite was pretty pathetic, but hearing him say it, hearing the cold assessment in his voice, reminded me of something important. My father had never spoken to me that way when he was alive. He'd been encouraging, supportive, always looking for the positive in whatever I was doing. This thing that looked like my father, that sounded like him and shared his memories, wasn't quite right. None of them were, I realized. They were too perfect, too focused on the single moment, like echoes of who they'd been rather than the complete people I remembered. "I think I'll pass," I said, taking a step back towards my tent. "Thanks for the offer, but I've got things to do, places to go." The change was immediate and terrifying. Their faces contorted with rage and disappointment, their bodies seeming to flicker and distort like images on a faulty television. The loving family I'd been talking dissolved, replaced by something hungry and desperate and utterly inhuman. "You can't leave," Emma hissed, her voice now echoing with harmonics that made my teeth ache. "You belong here with us. You're part of the family." They started moving towards me, no longer confined to the edge of the firelight. But as they approached, I could see through them, could see the trees and rain beyond their increasingly translucent forms. I ran from my tent, grabbed my car keys, and started toward the trail that led back to the parking area. Behind me, I could hear them following, not footsteps, but something like wind through dry leaves, punctuated by voices that were no longer quite human. "Michael, come back. Don't leave us alone again. You promised you'd always be our little boy." But I kept running, my torch beam bouncing wildly as I crashed through the undergrowth. The trail seemed longer than it had on my way in, full of roots and obstacles that set me sprawling more than once. And all the while, those voices followed me, growing more distorted and desperate with distance. When I finally reached my car, I was sobbing with exhaustion and terror. I threw my gear in the boot without bothering to pack it properly and drove out of that park faster than was strictly safe, the rain hammering on my windscreen like something trying to get in. I didn't stop until I reached Cedar Rapids. Didn't feel safe until I was locked in my hotel room with every light turned on. Even then, I kept thinking I could hear familiar voices calling my name from outside the window. The next morning, I changed my flight and went home to Manchester. I never looked up anything about Backbone State Park. Never tried to research what I'd experienced there. Some things are better left alone, aren't they? But sometimes, usually when it's raining hard like tonight, I find myself thinking about that campsite, about the family that's still there, still waiting around that eternal fire, still hoping that someday I'll come back and join them properly. And the terrible thing is, part of me will always want to go back to that moment when we were all together and happy, before life got complicated and people started dying and everything fell apart. But I know now that going back would mean never moving forward, that preserving that perfect moment would cost me every moment that came after. And despite what they said about my life being meaningless, I've actually done quite well since then. Got a new job, met someone nice, started building something real instead of just mourning what I'd lost. The rain's really coming down now, isn't it? Makes you think about all the places where families gather, all the moments of happiness that people would do anything to preserve forever. Makes you wonder how many of those moments are still out there, waiting in quiet places, calling to people who've lost more than they can bear. Makes you wonder whether you'd have the strength to walk away if you ever found yourself face to face with everyone you'd ever loved and lost. I hope you never have to find out. Do you know what it's like to go 3 days without proper sleep? Not just staying up late or having a rough night, but actual prolonged sleep deprivation? Your mind starts playing tricks on you. You see things that aren't there, hear conversations that never happened, lose track of where you are and what you're doing. I should know. I've been studying sleep disorders for 8 years when I finally cracked. And it was my own insomnia that brought me to Backbone State Park that October weekend. Ironic, really, a sleep researcher who couldn't sleep, like a chef who'd forgotten how to cook. It started during my residency at the University of Iowa hospitals. 18-hour shifts, endless case studies, the constant pressure trying to help people who came to our sleep clinic as a last resort. I was brilliant at diagnosing other people's sleep problems, prescribing treatments, explaining the neurological mechanisms behind their disorders. But somehow, In all that studying and treating, I had lost the ability to do the one thing that should have been most natural. The irony wasn't lost on my colleagues. Dr. James Crawford, sleep specialist, who had more than 3 hours of consecutive sleep in 6 months. They tried to be supportive at first, colleagues offering advice, suggesting treatments, even letting me participate in some of the research studies we were conducting. Nothing worked. That's how I found myself driving north from Iowa City on a Friday evening in October, my car packed with camping gear and a desperate plan. If medical science couldn't help me sleep, maybe nature could. Complete isolation, no screens, no artificial light, just me in the forest, and hopefully, finally, some bloody rest. The rain started just as I pulled into Backbone State Park, and I took it as a good sign. Rain had always been soothing to me as a child, the white noise that could usually lull me into at least a doze. Maybe this would be different. Maybe this would work. I chose Site 81 because it was listed as the most remote, nearly a mile hike from the car park through dense forest. If I was going to do this properly, I needed complete isolation from anything that might stimulate my overactive mind. No other campers, no park maintenance, no sounds of civilization whatsoever. The hike to the site took longer than expected. My torch beam kept catching glimpses of movement in the undergrowth, probably just small animals. But after months of sleep deprivation, my brain was interpreting every shadow as potential threat. I had to keep reminding myself that this was just the paranoia that comes with chronic insomnia, the way exhaustion makes you jump at your own reflection. Site 81 was perfect for my purposes. A small clearing surrounded by towering pines, so isolated that I couldn't even see the glow of other campsites through the trees. I set up my tent quickly, eager to get inside where I felt safer, then build a small fire more for psychological comfort than warmth. Have you ever been so tired that you're afraid to close your eyes? That was where I found myself that first night, sitting by the fire, knowing I desperately needed sleep, but terrified of what might happen if I let my guard down. In my exhausted state, every sound from the forest seemed amplified, potentially threatening. I brought along some of my research materials, case studies of extreme insomnia, sleep disorder documentation, EEG readouts showing the brain patterns of people like me. Looking at them now, by firelight in the middle of the Iowa wilderness, they seemed almost quaint. All those charts and graphs trying to quantify something that felt so fundamentally beyond measurement. That's when I started hearing the whispers, soft voices, just at the edge of audibility, seeming to come from the darkness beyond my fire. At first, I assumed it was the wind in the trees, or maybe distant conversations from other campers. But as I listened more carefully, I realized the voices were discussing me. Subject exhibits classic symptoms of chronic sleep deprivation. Neural pathways showing significant disruption. Recommend immediate intervention before permanent damage occurs. Medical terminology, clinical language, the sort of discussion you'd hear in a hospital corridor or research facility. But we were miles from civilization, and the voices had an odd quality, too clear, too precise, as if they were being transmitted rather than spoken naturally. I stood up from the fire, trying to locate the source of the voices. They seemed to be coming from multiple directions, overlapping conversations that painted a clinical picture of someone in severe psychological distress. Patient Crawford, James, age 34, presenting with treatment-resistant insomnia, paranoid ideation, and possible onset of sleep deprivation psychosis. They were talking about me, using my name, my medical history, discussing my condition like I was a case study rather than a person. But that was impossible. No one knew I was here, and even if someone did, why would they be conducting what sounded like a medical consultation in the middle of the forest? Dr. Crawford? The voice was clearer now, definitely addressing me directly. I spun around, shining my torch into the trees, but saw nothing except shadows and rain-slick bark. Dr. Crawford, we need you to come with us. You're in no condition to be alone out here. It sounded like Dr. Henderson, my department head back at the hospital. The same measured tone he used when discussing difficult cases. The same slight Midwestern accent. But Dr. Henderson was back in Iowa City, probably at home with his family, completely unaware that I'd gone camping. This isn't real, I said aloud, as much to convince myself as to address whatever was speaking to me. I'm hallucinating. This is just sleep deprivation causing auditory hallucinations. That's exactly why you need treatment, James. You're losing touch with reality. Come with us now, and we can help you get the rest you need. The voice was so reasonable, so concerned, and God, I wanted to believe it. After months of struggling alone, the idea that someone wanted to help me, that there was a solution to my problem, was almost irresistible. But something in my medical training kicked in, some part of my brain that was still functioning rationally despite the exhaustion. Auditory hallucinations were common in severe sleep deprivation, often taking the form of familiar voices offering comfort or guidance. This was a symptom, not salvation. I sat back down by the fire, trying to ignore the voices that continued to call my name from the darkness. But they were persistent, growing more urgent as the night wore on. James, you're making this harder than it needs to be. Just walk towards my voice. We have a facility nearby where you can get proper treatment. Dr. Crawford, please, your condition is deteriorating rapidly. Without intervention, you could suffer permanent neurological damage. We know about the hallucinations, James. We know about the paranoia, the confusion, the episodes where you lose time. It's all treatable if you'll just trust us. Have you ever been so desperate for help that you'd follow any voice that promised relief? Standing there in that rain-soaked forest, listening to what sounded like my colleagues offering the medical intervention I desperately needed, I found myself taking a step towards a tree lean. The voices grew more encouraging as I moved closer to the forest edge. That's it, James. Just keep walking towards us. We're right here just past these trees. The facility is warm and dry. You can sleep there, really sleep, for as long as you need. Your colleagues are waiting for you. Dr. Henderson, Dr. Martinez, the whole sleep disorders team. We've been so worried about you. I pushed through the undergrowth, my torch beam swinging wildly as I tried to follow the voices deeper into the forest. Branches caught my clothes, roots sent me stumbling, but the voices kept encouraging me forward. Almost there, James. Just a little further. You're doing so well. Soon you'll be able to rest properly. That's when I saw the lights ahead. Not torchlights or campfire flames, but the clean, sterile glow of fluorescent bulbs. Hospital lighting, shining through what looked like windows in the trees. As I got closer, I could make out the outline of a building, low, modern, institutional. Exactly the sort of place where sleep studies were conducted. The Sleep Disorders Research Facility, according to the sign by the entrance. A place I'd never heard of, never seen on any map, but which looked exactly like the kind of specialized clinic where someone with my condition might receive treatment. Through the windows, I could see familiar figures in white coats moving about with purpose. Dr. Henderson was there, consulting a clipboard. Dr. Martinez was adjusting some sort of monitoring equipment. Even Dr. Sarah Chun from the neurology department, someone I'd worked with on several cases. They all looked up as I approached, their faces brightening with relief and professional concern. James! Dr. Henderson called out, opening the facility's front door. Thank goodness you found us. We've been tracking your condition, and frankly, we're quite concerned. The interior of the facility was perfect, state-of-the-art sleep monitoring equipment. Comfortable beds with electrodes and sensors, Everything needed to conduct the kind of comprehensive sleep study that might finally diagnose and treat my condition. How did you know I was here? I asked, though part of me was too grateful to care about the logistics. We've been monitoring several cases like yours, Dr. Martinez explained, leading me towards what looked like a preparation room. Severe insomnia among medical professionals, particularly those specializing in sleep disorders. It's more common than you might think. The irony of a situation isn't lost on us, Dr. Chen added with a sympathetic smile. Doctors who treat sleep disorders but can't sleep themselves. There's clearly something systemic at work, something we need to understand better. They had me change into a hospital gown and began attaching the familiar electrodes I'd used on countless patients. EEG leads on my scalp, EMG sensors on my muscles, respiratory monitors around my chest. The whole setup was exactly what I would have prescribed for someone with my symptoms. This comprehensive study will help us understand exactly what's disrupting your sleep patterns, Dr. Henderson explained as they worked. We'll monitor your brain activity, muscle tension, breathing, even your eye movements. By morning, we should have enough data to prescribe an effective treatment. Have you ever wanted something so badly that you ignored all the warning signs telling you it was too good to be true? Lying there in that comfortable bed, surrounded by concerned colleagues and state-of-the-art equipment. I felt the first genuine relaxation I'd experienced in months. Just close your eyes, James, Dr. Chen said softly. Let yourself drift off. We'll be monitoring everything, making sure you're safe. I closed my eyes, feeling the delicious weight of approaching sleep. For the first time in half a year, my mind began to quiet, my muscles began to relax, my breathing began to slow into the rhythms of natural rest. But just as I was about to slip into unconsciousness, something made me open my eyes again. The monitoring equipment was wrong. Not wrong in any obvious way, but wrong in a way that only someone with my specialized knowledge would notice. The EEG readout was showing patterns that weren't quite right for a human brain. The respiratory monitor was tracking rhythms that didn't match actual breathing. The muscle sensors were reading tensions that didn't correspond to real physical states. It was all fake, elaborate, convincing, but fundamentally artificial. I sat up abruptly, pulling off the electrodes, suddenly wide awake and alert in a way I hadn't been for months. Where am I really? I demanded. Dr. Henderson's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. You're exactly where you need to be, James. Please lie back down and let us help you. This isn't real. None of this is real. You're not my colleagues. This isn't a medical facility, and those aren't real monitors. Sleep deprivation can cause significant paranoia and delusional thinking, Dr. Martinez said in a calm, clinical tone. What you're experiencing right now is a textbook example of psychotic ideation brought on by chronic insomnia. But even as he spoke, I could see cracks appearing in the facade. The walls of the facility looked less solid now, more like theatrical sets. The equipment was making sounds that no real medical device would make. And my colleagues, the more I looked at them, the less they looked like the people I knew. You're not real, I said, backing toward what I hoped was the exit. Your hallucinations, elaborate ones, but still just products of my sleep-deprived brain. James, please, Dr. Chen said, but her voice was becoming distorted, echoing strangely in the room. You need treatment. You need rest. If you leave now, you may never get another chance to sleep properly. And that was the most terrifying thing of all, because part of me believed her. Part of me was willing to accept this elaborate delusion if it meant finally getting the rest I desperately needed. But my medical training, the rational part of my mind that had somehow survived months of sleep deprivation, knew that giving in to this hallucination would be the end of whatever sanity I had left. I ran for the door, crashing through what felt like cardboard walls, bursting out into the forest night. Behind me, I could hear the voices of my fake colleagues calling out in concern and frustration. "James, come back. You're not well. You need treatment. You can't survive much longer without proper sleep. This is your last chance for help." But I kept running, my torch beam bouncing wildly as I crashed through the undergrowth, trying to find my way back to my campsite. The forest seemed different now, more hostile, full of obstacles that hadn't been there before. But at least it was real. At least it was actual trees and mud and rain, rather than some elaborate construction of my exhausted mind. When I finally stumbled back into my campsite, I was sobbing with exhaustion and relief. My tent was still there, my fire still burning low, everything exactly as I'd left it, real, tangible, mundane. I crawled into my tent and lay there shaking, not from cold, but from the realization of how close I'd come to losing myself completely. The hallucination had been so elaborate, so convincing, so perfectly tailored to what I most desperately wanted. But here's the strange thing. After that night of terror, after confronting the most elaborate hallucination of my life, I finally began to sleep again. Not deeply, but real sleep nonetheless. As if facing the worst my condition could throw at me had somehow broken its power over me. I stayed in the forest for 2 more nights, gradually recovering my ability to rest naturally. By the time I hiked back to my car, I felt more human than I had in months. The drive back to Iowa City gave me time to think about what had happened. In my medical training, we'd studied cases of sleep deprivation psychosis, but experiencing it firsthand had taught me something that no textbook could convey. The mind, when pushed to its limits, doesn't just break down. It creates elaborate alternative realities designed to give us what we think we need. But sometimes what we think we need isn't what we actually need. Sometimes the cure is worse than the disease. I went back to work the following week, but with a new understanding of my patients and their struggles. I'd been inside the experience they were trying to describe, felt the desperation that drives people to seek increasingly extreme solutions to their sleep problems. More importantly, I'd learned that some battles have to be fought alone, in real places with real consequences, not in the comfortable illusions our minds create to protect us from difficulty. The rain's really coming down tonight, isn't it? Makes you think about all the times your mind has tried to convince you that the easy solution, the comfortable option, was the right one. Makes you wonder how many elaborate fantasies we construct to avoid dealing with the hard realities of our lives. But here's what I learned in that Iowa forest. Sometimes the most helpful thing you can do is refuse help, especially when that help comes too easily, feels too perfect, promises too much. Because real healing, real rest, real peace, they don't come from elaborate facilities staffed by perfect colleagues offering miraculous cures. They come from sitting alone in the rain, facing your demons without assistance, and discovering that you're stronger than you thought. Even when you haven't slept properly in 6 months. Even when your mind is creating elaborate hallucinations to tempt you away from reality. Even when the voices in the darkness sound exactly like the people you trust most. Sweet dreams. Have you ever been truly hungry? Not just peckish before dinner or slightly empty after skipping lunch, but genuinely, desperately hungry, the kind that gnaws at your stomach and makes your hands shake? Most of us in the modern world never experience real hunger. We're blessed with abundance, with grocery stores and restaurants and the comfortable certainty that our next meal is never far away. But what if that hunger never stopped? What if no amount of food could satisfy it? What if eating only made it worse? I learned the answer to those questions during what was supposed to be a peaceful camping weekend in Cherokee National Forest. It was early November 2018, and I had driven down from Louisville to escape the stress of managing my family's restaurant. We'd been struggling financially, working 16-hour days just to keep the doors open, and I desperately needed a break from the constant worry about inventory, staff, and bills. The irony wasn't lost on me. A man who spent his life around food seeking solace in the wilderness. But sometimes you need to get away from your passion to remember why you love it. I'd packed light, planning to do some serious hiking, and perhaps some soul-searching about whether it was time to sell the restaurant and find a less stressful career. The campsite I'd chosen was beautifully remote, nestled in a valley where ancient oaks created a natural canopy overhead. The autumn leaves were past their peak, but still lovely, deep golds and russets that carpeted the forest floor. There was something almost primordial about the place, as if it had remained unchanged since Cherokee tribes first walked these mountains. I spent Friday afternoon setting up camp and exploring the immediate area. The forest was quiet except for the rustle of leaves and the distant call of birds, perfect for the kind of solitary reflection I was seeking. As evening approached, I built a small fire and prepared a simple dinner. Nothing fancy, just beans and sausage cooked over flames. But as I sat down to eat, something strange happened. The food smelled wrong. Not spoiled or rotten, but empty, like the aroma had been drained out of it, leaving only the ghost of what should have been a hearty, satisfying meal. I took a bite anyway, figuring it was just my imagination, but the taste was as hollow as the smell. The beans had the right texture, the sausage the right consistency, but there was no flavor, no substance. It was like eating cardboard shaped to resemble food. I tried adding salt, then hot sauce from my camping supplies. Nothing helped. The meal remained utterly bland, completely unsatisfying. Worse, after I'd forced myself to eat what should have been a filling portion, I was still hungry. Not just hungry, ravenous. My stomach was cramping with need, as if I hadn't eaten in days. I chalked it up to stress and the change in environment. Sometimes when you're dealing with chronic anxiety, your body reacts in unexpected ways. I made myself a cup of tea and tried to relax by the fire, but the hunger only grew stronger. By the time I went to bed, I was genuinely uncomfortable. The hunger had evolved from a mild annoyance to a constant, gnawing presence that made it difficult to concentrate on anything else. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to my stomach growl and gurgle, wondering if I was coming down with some sort of illness. I woke up Saturday morning absolutely famished. Not just morning hunger, but the kind of desperate need for food that makes your hands shake and your vision blur slightly around the edges. I'd packed plenty of provisions, granola bars, dried fruit, instant oatmeal, canned goods. But when I tried to eat breakfast, the same thing happened. The oatmeal looked normal, smelled normal, but tasted like nothing. I might as well have been eating wet cardboard. And no matter how much I consumed, the hunger only intensified. It was as if my body was rejecting the food while simultaneously craving more. By midday, I was starting to panic. I'd eaten what should have been 2 full meals, plus several snacks, but I felt weaker and hungrier than when I'd started. This wasn't normal. This wasn't stress or illness or any rational explanation I could construct. I decided to hike into the forest, hoping that physical activity might distract me from the constant gnawing in my gut. But as I walked deeper into the wilderness, I began to notice something disturbing about the landscape itself. The trees looked drained. That's the only way I can describe it. Their bark was gray and lifeless, their remaining leaves brittle and colorless. Even the forest floor seemed depleted, as if something had sucked the vitality out of everything growing here. And I was getting hungrier with every step. Have you ever noticed how hunger affects your thinking? At first, it's just a distraction. Then it becomes harder to concentrate on anything else. Eventually, if it gets bad enough, it starts to consume your thoughts entirely. You can't focus on conversation or work or entertainment because your mind keeps circling back to the desperate need for sustenance. That's where I was by Saturday afternoon. The hunger had become so intense that I could barely think about anything else. Every thought led back to food, not specific dishes or flavors, because everything I tried to eat had been tasteless. But just the desperate, animalistic need to consume something, anything, that might satisfy this impossible craving. I tried eating more of my supplies. Granola bars, trail mix, even plain crackers. Nothing helped. If anything, each attempt to eat made the hunger worse, as if my body was rejecting the food while simultaneously demanding more. As evening approached, I was genuinely frightened. I consumed enough calories to sustain a person for several days, but I felt like I was starving to death. My hands were shaking constantly now, and I was having trouble maintaining my balance. This wasn't just hunger, this was something else entirely. That's when I encountered the other camper. He emerged from the forest just as I was trying to force down another tasteless meal, a man in his 50s with hollow eyes and clothes that hung loose on his gaunt frame. He moved with the careful, deliberate steps of someone conserving energy, but his gaze was sharp and alert. "The food doesn't work, does it?" he said without preamble. I looked up from my untouched plate of beans. "What?" "The food. It has no taste, no substance. You can eat and eat and eat, but the hunger never stops. In fact, it gets worse." My heart started racing. "How do you know that?" He sat down across from my fire, uninvited but somehow not unwelcome. "Because I've been here for 3 weeks, trying to understand what's happening to me, to us. Us. There are others, campers who came here for a peaceful weekend and found themselves trapped by a hunger that can't be satisfied. We're scattered throughout the forest, all experiencing the same thing." I stared at him, trying to process this information. That's impossible. People would notice if campers were going missing. There would be search parties, investigations. Would there? "How long have you been here?" "Since yesterday." "Check your phone." "What's the date?" I pulled out my phone, expecting to see November 3rd, but the screen showed November 17th, 2 weeks later than it should have been. "That's not right," I said, checking the date again. "My phone must be malfunctioning." "Is it? Or have you been here longer than you remember?" When you're this hungry, this consumed by the need to eat, does time have the same meaning? Can you remember what you did yesterday? The day before? I tried to recall the previous day clearly, and found that I couldn't. The memories were there, but they were vague, repetitive. Waking up hungry, trying to eat tasteless food, growing more desperate. Had I been doing the same thing for weeks without realizing it? What's happening to us? I asked. "I have a theory, but you won't like it. This forest, it's hungry too, has been for a very long time. And it's feeding on us, slowly draining our essence while keeping us alive and desperate. That's insane." "Is it? Look around. Really look. Have you noticed how lifeless everything seems? The trees, the plants, even the soil? This place is starving, just like we are. But while we grow weaker, it grows stronger." I followed his gaze, taking in the gray, depleted landscape around us. Now that he'd pointed it out, the signs were everywhere. The forest wasn't just dormant for winter. It was actively dying or already dead. "So what do we do?" I asked. "That's what I've been trying to figure out. I've explored most of the valley, and I found others like us. Some have been here for months, maybe longer. They're not doing well." "What do you mean?" "The hunger doesn't kill you, but it changes you, makes you desperate, makes you consider things you never would have considered before." There was something in his tone that made me deeply uneasy. "What kind of things?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "There's another camper about 2 miles north of here. Been here since September, maybe longer. He told me something that's been keeping me awake at night. What? He said the only time the hunger stops, the only time he feels satisfied, is when another camper disappears. My blood went cold. Disappears how? That's just it. He doesn't know. People arrive, stay for what feels like a few days, but turns out to be weeks or months. And then they're gone. No sign of struggle, no indication of where they went. Just gone. And when that happens, the hunger stops temporarily, for a day, maybe two, like the forest has been fed and doesn't need to drain us as intensely. But then it starts again worse than before. I thought about this, try and make sense of it. So the forest is using us as some sort of battery, keeping us alive but slowly consuming us. That's my theory. And when it's finished with one of us, when there's nothing left to drain, we disappear. And the forest gets a bigger meal, which sustains it long enough to trap more victims. But how? How does it keep us here? I could leave right now. Could you? When was the last time you tried to find your way back to your car? I realized with growing horror that I couldn't remember. I knew I'd hiked away from my campsite, but I couldn't recall the route back. Worse, I couldn't summon the will to try. The hunger was so overwhelming that the idea of walking for hours without the possibility of food seemed impossible. It's insidious, he continued. The hunger makes you weak, makes it hard to think clearly or make decisions. You become focused entirely on immediate need for sustenance. Long-term planning, like escape, becomes nearly impossible. So we're trapped here until it finishes feeding on us. Unless we can find another way out. That's what I've been working on. Trying to understand how this thing operates, whether there's a way to break free. Have you found anything? Maybe. The other campers I've talked to, they all arrived on different dates, but they all have one thing in common. They came here when they were dealing with some sort of crisis related to food or sustenance. I thought about my own situation. The struggling restaurant, the financial stress, the constant worry about keeping the business fed with customers and revenue. I run a restaurant, I said. It's been failing. That's why I came here, to think about whether to keep fighting or give up. He nodded grimly. The woman I found near the creek, she's a food critic who'd been getting death threats from a chef she'd given a bad review to. The man up north used to work for a food aid organization until he was fired for skimming donations. The pattern holds for everyone I've met. So it targets people who have complicated relationships with food. More than that, people whose livelihood, whose identity, whose sense of self-worth is tied up in feeding others or being fed. It's like the forest can sense that vulnerability and exploit it. The fire was burning low, and I found myself adding more wood without really thinking about it. The simple act of tending the flames felt soothing, a small ritual of normalcy in this increasingly surreal situation. You said you might have found a way out. I reminded him. I'm not sure the way out so much as a different kind of trap, but it might be better than slowly starving to death while being kept alive by something that feeds on our desperation. Tell me. There's a place deeper in the forest. The others call it the heart. It's where the hunger is strongest, but also where the forest's influence is most concentrated. I think if we could get there, we might be able to confront whatever is doing this to us directly. That sounds incredibly dangerous. More dangerous than staying here until we disappear one by one. Look at yourself. Really look. When was the last time you saw your reflection? I realized I hadn't. I've been avoiding mirrors, water surfaces, anything that might show me what I looked like. But now, using the black screen of my phone as a makeshift mirror, I saw what he meant. I was gaunt, not just thin, but hollow-cheeked and sunken-eyed, like someone who'd been starving for months. My clothes hung loose on a frame that seemed to have lost substantial weight since. When, yesterday? Last week? Time had become so fluid that I couldn't be sure. How long have I really been here? I asked, does it matter? The question is, do you want to spend what's left of your life slowly wasting away while something feeds on your desperation? Or do you want to face it directly? I looked around at the gray, lifeless forest, felt a constant gnawing in my gut that no amount of food could satisfy, and realized he was right. Whatever was happening here, passively enduring it wasn't going to save me. Where is this heart? I asked, follow the creek upstream for about 3 miles. You'll know it when you see it. Everything dead converges there. But I should warn you, the hunger gets worse the closer you get. By the time you reach the center, you'll be barely human. And you think confronting whatever's there will help? I think it's the only chance we have. The alternative is to keep deteriorating until we disappear like the others. We sat in silence for a while, both lost in our own thoughts. The fire crackled between us, but even its warmth felt somehow hollow, unable to truly comfort or sustain us. I'm going tomorrow, he said finally. You can come with me, or you can stay here and hope for a different solution. But I won't wait much longer. I can feel myself getting weaker every day. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I was agreeing to anything. The idea of venturing deeper into this cursed forest, toward the source of whatever was consuming us, terrified me. But the alternative, slowly starving while being kept alive by malevolent forces, was worse. That night, I dreamed of my restaurant, but in the dream, the kitchen was empty, the dining room deserted, and I was standing behind the bar trying to serve food that had no taste, no substance, to customers who couldn't be satisfied. I woke up more exhausted than when I'd gone to sleep, the hunger so intense that I doubled over with cramps. My camping companion was gone when I woke up. No note, no sign of where he'd headed. Just the cold ashes of our shared fire and the memory of his hollow-eyed warning. I tried to eat breakfast, but as usual, the food was tasteless and unsatisfying. The hunger only grew stronger. I packed light and followed the creek upstream, driven by a combination of desperation and curiosity. What was at the heart of this cursed place? What kind of entity could drain the life from an entire forest while keeping its victims alive just long enough to feed on their suffering? The hike was harder than I expected, not because of the terrain, which was relatively gentle, but because of the increasing hunger. With each mile, the gnawing in my stomach became more intense, more consuming. By the time I'd walked 2 miles, I could barely think about anything else. The forest around me grew increasingly desolate. Trees that had merely looked drained near my campsite were completely dead here, gray, skeletal things reaching toward a sky they could no longer touch. The creek itself seemed lifeless, flowing without the music that water usually makes. And then I saw it. The heart wasn't what I'd expected. Instead of some ancient evil or supernatural entity, it was simply a clearing. But it was the most wrong thing I'd ever encountered. A perfect circle of barren earth surrounded by the corpses of trees, with nothing growing, nothing moving, nothing alive except the figures scattered around its perimeter. There were dozens of them, campers, hikers, people who'd come to Cherokee National Forest seeking peace or adventure and found something else entirely. They sat or lay around the edge of the clearing, all facing inward, all with that same hollow-eyed, gone appearance I'd seen in my reflection. And they were all eating. Not food. There was no food here. They were eating dirt, leaves, bark, anything they could put in their mouths. Their movements were mechanical, compulsive, like people trapped in an endless loop of desperate consumption that could never satisfy them. Some had been there so long that their fingernails were gone from clawing at the earth. Others had worn their teeth down to nubs from gnawing on stones and wood. But the worst part was their eyes. They were still aware, still conscious, still suffering. This wasn't madness or unconsciousness. It was eternal, unsatisfiable hunger made manifest. In the center of the clearing, I could see what was feeding on them. It wasn't a creature or entity in any conventional sense, but rather an absence, a void in the shape of hunger itself. It pulsed with a rhythm like a heartbeat, drawing sustenance from every desperate soul around its perimeter, and I could feel it calling to me. The hunger that had been gnawing at me for days suddenly intensified beyond anything I had experienced. My knees buckled, and I found myself crawling toward the clearing, drawn by a need so overwhelming that it erased every other thought, every other desire except the impossible hope that maybe, finally, I could find something to eat that would satisfy this terrible emptiness inside me. I joined the circle of the damned, taking my place among the others who'd been lured here by their own desperate hungers. I began eating handfuls of dirt, leaves, anything I could grab, while the thing in the center of the clearing fed on my desperation. But even as I lost myself to the compulsion, some small part of my mind remained clear, the part that had spent years running a restaurant, understanding the relationship between hunger and satisfaction, between need and fulfillment. This thing, it wasn't really feeding us. It was feeding on our hunger itself. The more desperate we became, the stronger it grew. The consumption was just a side effect, a way to keep us trapped in a cycle of need that could never be satisfied. And that gave me an idea. What if the solution wasn't to feed the hunger, but to starve it? What if the only way to defeat something that fed on desperation was to find a way not to be desperate? Fighting against every instinct, every compulsion, I stopped eating. I sat back on my heels and forced myself to be still, to breathe, to think about something other than the terrible gnawing in my gut. I thought about my restaurant, not the failing business that had driven me here, but the early days when I first opened it. The joy of creating something beautiful and nourishing, of bringing people together around good food and conversation. I remembered the satisfaction, not of being fed, but of feeding others. The hunger was still there, still terrible, but for the first time in days, it wasn't the only thing in my mind. And as I focused on those memories of nurturing rather than need, I felt something shift in the clearing. The void at the center pulsed more weakly. The compulsive eating of the others slowed slightly. Whatever was feeding on us, it was growing weaker as I withdrew my desperation from its reach. I stood up, still fighting the hunger but no longer controlled by it, and walked toward the center of the clearing. The void writhed and pulsed, trying to drag me back into its cycle of consumption, but I held on to memory of feeding others, of creating satisfaction rather than experiencing it. When I reached the heart of the hunger, I did something that went against every instinct. I offered it a different kind of nourishment. "You're hungry too," I said to the thing that had no form, no voice, no presence except need. "You've been starving for so long that you've forgotten anything exists except hunger. But there's another way." I reached into my pack and pulled out a photograph I always carried. A picture from my restaurant's opening day, showing a table full of friends laughing together over a meal I prepared. Not the food itself, but the joy it had created, the connections it had fostered. "This is what food is really for," I said, holding out the picture. "Not just sustenance, but community. Not just survival, but celebration. You've been feeding on hunger for so long that you've forgotten what satisfaction actually feels like." The void reached for a photograph with tendrils of pure need, and for a moment, I thought it would simply consume this memory like it had consumed everything else. But instead, something extraordinary happened. The emptiness at the center of the clearing began to fill, not with substance, but with understanding. The hunger that had defined this place for so long was replaced by something else. Not satisfaction exactly, but the memory of what satisfaction felt like, the possibility of it. The other campers around the clearing stopped their compulsive eating and looked up with clearer eyes, as if waking from a long nightmare. The dead trees around the perimeter shuddered and began to show the faintest hint of green. Even the lifeless creek started to sing again. I don't know how long I stood there, watching the heart of the forest remember what it meant to nourish rather than consume. But eventually, I felt the terrible hunger that had plagued me for days begin to fade, not disappearing entirely, but returning to normal human proportions. The kind of hunger that could be satisfied by a good meal share with friends. When I finally made it back to my campsite, I found my car keys exactly where I'd left them, though it felt like I had been searching for them for weeks. The drive back to Louisville was surreal. Returning to a world where food had taste, where meals could satisfy, where hunger was a temporary condition rather than a permanent state of being. I reopened my restaurant a month later, not because the financial situation had magically improved, but because I'd remembered why I'd started it in the first place. Not to make money or achieve success, but to feed people, to create those moments of satisfaction and community that I'd shown to the hungry void in Cherokee Forest. The business is thriving now, though I run it differently. I focus more on the experience than the profit, more on bringing people together than on maximizing revenue, because I learned something important in that curse clearing. Hunger is only terrible when it can't be satisfied, but true satisfaction comes not from consuming, but from nourishing others. I still think about the other campers I saw around that clearing. Some of them made it out. I've heard stories of people emerging from Cherokee Forest after being missing for weeks or months, all with similar tales of inexplicable hunger and lost time. But others may still be there, learning the difference between consuming and nourishing, between taking and giving. If you ever find yourself camping in Cherokee National Forest, pay attention to how your food tastes. If it starts to seem hollow, flavorless, unsatisfying, leave immediately. Don't wait to see if it gets better. Don't assume it's just stress or altitude or a change in water, because there are hungers in this world that can never be satisfied by eating. And sometimes the only way to defeat them is to remember what true nourishment feels like, the kind that comes from feeding others rather than feeding yourself. The forest remembers now, but it's still hungry, still searching for people whose relationship with sustenance is complicated enough to be exploited. Don't let it be you. Sometimes the most dangerous hunger is the one that grows stronger every time you try to feed it.